Welcome everyone. Today's session, The Road to Green Steel is Paved with Trust. I'm Sarah Fitzgerald, and together with Paul Ebert from Worley, we welcome you here to the first session to kick off the Australian Pavilion at COP28. As is probably indicative of the energy transition, one of our panellists hasn't quite made it to COP yet, and he's still stuck in traffic, so we're hustling and we're pivoting and we're rechanging our presentation. So a very informal conversation today. I hope you are, you're ready to unpack a very interesting topic with us. And let's see if we can get the technology to work. No? Never worked with technology, children or animals. How are we going? I'll leave that to happen in the background and perhaps introduce our panellists. Catherine Demansky joins us today, and she's an independent steering committee member of the Net Zero Australia project. Rowan Foley from the Aboriginal Carbon Foundation is stuck in traffic and may join us or may not. And my co-host, Paul Ebert, who's the Group Director, Sustainability and Energy Transition Leadership at Worley. I feel like I'm really having to hustle over the noise up the back here. We'll have our details up on the screen at the end of the session, and we'd love to engage with you in a conversation where we can showcase some of the work that Catherine and Paul and Rowan and I do. To begin with, we thought it was important to give you a quick sort of we're working, to give you a quick overview of today's session. And that's firstly, what is green steel, why it's important to the energy transition, and why it's such a significant potential for Australia. We also thought we'd recognise that a key part of the pathway to green steel requires the development of large-scale infrastructure. This will have impacts on land, on water, and most significantly on community. And so it must involve genuine engagement that includes the building and maintaining of trust. In Australia, First Nations people hold rights and interests in over 50% of Australia's landmass, and they hold 65,000 years of knowledge of Australia's land and natural resources, which is vital to underpinning a fair and just energy transition. In addition, other stakeholders in our broader community must also form an important part of this process. So let's begin with the green steel value proposition. I want to welcome Catherine Demansky, the member of the Net Zero Australia Committee, to tell us more about this. Over to you, Catherine.
Thanks very much, Sarah. And it's really fantastic to be here. Could I just ask the people who are having coffee, I love the buzz that's coming there, but it's actually really hard to hear from here. So if you wouldn't mind just keeping it down at the back, I'd really appreciate it. And we've got some really interesting stuff to tell you about green steel, Australia and the community. So I'd really appreciate that, guys. So let's talk about green steel, and I'd like to set the context for the discussion about trust and communities by answering really three questions. So the questions are: why is green steel important for the environment? Environment. Why is green steel important for Australia? And what does green steel actually mean for Australia? So just working through that. Why is green steel important for the climate? You may or may not know that producing steel is incredibly energy intensive. The global emissions is 8% of global CO2 emissions annually. And it uses coal both as a fuel and as a reduction agent. So to give you a sense of the problem, for every tonne of steel that's produced using coal-based production methods in a conventional blast furnace, you're looking at one tonne of steel to up to 3 tonnes of carbon emissions, which is quite extraordinary, right? There are a number of steps where you can replace that coal and with clean energy, and that's what you call green steel. Now, in Australia, the reduction stage is really the benefit, or the sweet spot, is around the beneficiation stage, that front end, because our iron ore levels, the iron levels in our ore is a little bit lower than what can be used in the blast furnaces. So in this context, we'll be talking about green steel as really green iron, right, before you make the steel. So moving to direct reduced iron, it removes coal from the picture, and you can use that clean electricity generated by hydrogen, and there are global initiatives and interest to move the sector towards that low carbon production method. So, why is green steel important for Australia? You may or may not know, but actually Australia is the world's largest exporter of iron ore, with 54% of the global market. So it's quite big. And it's our largest export at $134 billion. It surpasses coal and it surpasses LNG. So there's a strategic opportunity for us to enhance our export commodity. And we have a comparative advantage because we're a renewable superpower. You may have heard that term, because of the combination of export scale clean energy resources and also the iron ore resources. But we're also competing with new kids on the block in this space. Our traditional competitors in iron ore and energy are actually going to become new. They're the ones that have clean energy resources of a scale that can be exported. And we're looking at Brazil, we're looking at Africa and some parts of the Middle East. So, now you know what green steel is, now you know why it's important for Australia, what the opportunity is. What does it mean for Australia? So, to do that, let's have a look, to even before we go there, let's look at what it would take to get to net zero in mid-century before I dive into that question. Great. So, the question of what it would take to get to net zero for Australia by mid-century was something that the Net Zero Australia project looked like. To give you some context before we dive into a couple of interesting slides for you, it was a whole of economy project, desktop study, which looked at the domestic and export emissions, what it would take based on scenarios to get to net zero. It showed pathways using scenarios, some bookends, so full renewable versus constrained renewable. What would it take? And you may think, yeah, that's all been done before. But the difference here is it actually looked at it in time steps of 5 years, and it also looked at areas that you could actually put this infrastructure. So, this is what we have. 2020 was the baseline year, and this is what Australia looked like from an energy generation perspective in 2020. Remember that? COVID years. Why did we take that year? It was when we had the comprehensive data that was available to do our work. So if you have a look, there's some renewable, there are some transmission lines on the east coast there, a little bit of solar, the colours aren't great, a little bit of wind, but not really very, not very prominent. On the west coast, which is where I'm from, based in Perth, you have a little bit, but quite remote and quite sparse. So hang on, yep, let's go to the next slide. What would it look like in 2020? So just take a minute there to have a look at that from where we were before. What you're seeing here is large-scale renewable energy hubs, which generate basically the equivalent energy that we have to support domestic and exports. If you have a look at it, these are effectively, rule of thumb, the size of a Tasmania, those remote hubs. Solar Tasmania, as we like to call them. They're spread across the northern Sunbelt, so in remote areas where this will have impacts on communities and supply chains. Now be aware that these just look at the renewable energy hubs, right? It only looks at the solar and the transmission lines that you need. It doesn't actually cover all the supporting infrastructure that you need for a firm energy system. So to get that, you get your solar, you have to convert it to hydrogen, you have to transport that hydrogen. To make the green hydrogen, you need to get water, you need to get from the coastline. So this is just the power lines and the solar hubs, right? So it's quite extraordinary. And if you look at it, coming to the topic of the day, it's in remote areas. What we saw in the study was that actually in these areas, about 43% of the projects are situated on Indigenous estate lands. So there are some real some issues to be navigated here in these new areas that haven't really been impacted by such large-scale build-out of infrastructure. And the scale and speed of the rollout of this energy system is going to be quite extraordinary. It's not like anything that we've seen before, and it is going to throw up new issues for us. So, this is what it looks like if we continue to export energy and the raw ore to our trading partners. We did a little bit of work in Net Zero to look at an onshoring scenario where we would look at perhaps taking some of the steps and putting them onshore to maintain our export economy, because Australia, unlike other countries, is very much an exporting nation. Great. Next slide. And we'll go back. Can we go back one? So onshoring, if you have a look at it, it's smaller. And you go, hang on a second, what's going on there? It reduces the infrastructure required in the order of 50% to be able to take some of the beneficiation and reduction steps of iron ore in Australia. And that's because, as you know, hydrogen and converting hydrogen to an exportable form is thermodynamically inefficient and you lose so much. So if we were trying to export the amount of hydrogen, you have that much larger footprint, but if you use it where you produce it, it's much more efficient, which means you need less of it, which means you need less infrastructure and it's going to cost you less. These are all really good things. What we're seeing, just to give you some figures, is the levelised costs of doing this would be about in the order of 40% less than exporting primary clean energy by 2060, in the order of 3 billion versus 5 billion, so there's a prize to be gained there. So it's a great opportunity for Australia to help decarbonise the global steel industry and also capture some of the opportunities that are coming up offered by green steel. With that, I'll hand back to Sarah. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Catherine. As a girl from Tassie, those infrastructure maps are quite confronting. I'm used to a boot for scale, not my island home for scale, so a bit of a mind blow. But it does help, I think you'll agree, to frame the challenge that's in front of us. And considering that infrastructure challenge, I'll hand over to Paul now to build a little bit on the set of the context and trust in net zero. Thanks, Paul.
Yep, you can go to the next slide. Hello, everyone. This is going to be a very organic talk, given one of our key speakers is stuck on a train, I believe. What I want to do is explore this issue of infrastructure. And the context for green steel in Australia is actually an infrastructure issue involving multiple technologies and enablers. And if you consider the simple numbers and then drape that infrastructure over the landscape, you get the sort of maps you've just seen. But I want to step up a step and look at the macro issue that's involved in infrastructure globally. And to do this, I want to refer to some work that we've been involved with Princeton University. It's called the From Ambition to Reality series. Princeton in 2019 did a very interesting piece of work looking at net zero in the US. Lots of people have looked at scenarios about taking economies to net zero. What Princeton did, which was different, is they draped that down to infrastructure on the ground. No one else had actually done that. And when you do that, this penny sort of drops on the amount of infrastructure that is needed. And this is the same sort of thing that Catherine showed, obviously in the US. But if we start by the year 2020, and this is actually the renewable energy infrastructure in the US. Now, to get the US to net zero, just one step, please, you end up with an infrastructure map which looks something like this. So huge areas of solar and wind and the enabling grid infrastructure behind that. But what's really important is the devil's in the detail here. So next click. Let's just look down at a more micro level at what that might look like for a community. In this case, it's the city of St. Louis. So just go to the next slide. So there's that same area shown with the current wind and solar infrastructure in that area. In fact, there is no solar and wind infrastructure in that area. Now, what Net Zero America did, that Princeton did, is they did a techno-economic solve with a whole bunch of assumptions on what the renewable component would be of a solve. If you just click the button, this is what it actually looks like. So when you consider the micro level, a number of things jump out. And as an infrastructure deliverer, a lot of alarm bells go off when we see maps like this. And for pretty obvious reasons. And just to set the context, next click. So what we've got here is the red are actually solar facilities, the little blue areas are wind facilities, and the purple lines are new transmission infrastructure. So when you look at a map like that as a delivery company, you have to say, well, how is that going to happen? Not just in scale, but importantly, how is that community going to accept that level of infrastructure? Just one more click. So a new level of social contract is going to be needed for this type of infrastructure development. I'm just setting the context here at a global scale, so just one more click. Let's just look at that in an Australian sense. Now, this is one of the largest solar power stations in Australia. I don't believe it's the largest. I think it's been surpassed since we put this slide deck together. If you look at the Net Zero Australia numbers, Australia would need to develop something like 3,000 gigawatts of renewable capacity by 2050 if we were to reach mid-century net zero. To kind of put that in perspective, it's building one of these facilities every week for the next 30 years. One more click. It's an 8 to 15-fold increase in the amount of electricity generation. More than 140 million tonnes of clean hydrogen. Almost a gigaton of CO2 being sequestered. And we would need direct air capture in all our scenarios, all the scenarios that were modelled, up to 100 megatons of CO2 per year. In fact, we would need to replicate the entire world renewable energy fleet in Australia by 2050. Now, you could easily say that's impossible. And what Princeton asked us as a development company is, well, if that's what we've got to do, how would we do that? Next slide, thanks. And that's where this From Ambition to Reality work came from. Our thesis is that a new paradigm is needed in the way we deliver infrastructure, and that's represented by these 5 shifts. Just quickly go through these shifts. The first one is around broadening value. So rather than driving technology developments which purely hinge on economic value, we need to broaden that value to include environmental value and social value in the decision-making processes. The second shift is around enabling technologies. We need absolutely every technology option we have on the table, and it has to work well. We can't afford to be ideological on technology. We do need every option we have. And that's particularly the case when you reach some kind of social barrier, because all technologies will reach barriers at some point, and we need to pivot to another technology. The third shift is around standardisation and replication. We need to standardise everything we do as much as we can as possible, give the supply chain time to standardise, get the equipment flow necessary. This is like infrastructure development on steroids. So how do you do it? The orange one there is around creating partnerships. We need partnerships and collaboration like the world depends on it. So a new level of collaboration is needed. And the green one there is the digital accelerant. Digital accelerant's an interesting one. It's using the power of digitisation to drive faster response. But here I want to introduce this issue of trust. One thing you can do with a digital mechanism is actually build trust in the outcomes. You can build trust in the decarbonisation outcomes, for example. And in fact, if you look across all of these shifts, one thing that's missing is a level of trust. And we think, and our thesis is, that there is a deficit of trust. We think it's actually getting worse. To build the sort of infrastructure we're talking about here, we need a new level of trust to emerge. And this is particularly acute with communities. So we want to explore now what that actually means in terms of building trust. Our missing panellist was a First Nations man, and that would have been very interesting to hear his view. But we'll do our best to look at the issues around that. So that's all from me, Sarah.
We on? Thank you. Okay, thank you very much. So now we're going to spend some time with the panel exploring these challenges and opportunities, and what does trust really mean within communities, and what changes communities are sort of seeking in that development of trust. What have we learnt from the past, both the good, the bad and the ugly, and how can that shape the steps we take in the future? And finally, beyond theory, what are some of the practical things we can actually, immediate practical steps we can actually take to move from the theoretical to the on-ground, real-life action that's required? So Paul, I'm going to start with you. Perhaps you could tell us about, you talk about trust. What do you mean by trust?
It's a good question. We think this has many dimensions. It's not just about trust with communities, it's also about trust across the ecosystem of what we call infrastructure participants. And let me give you an example. A new technology comes along, there are plenty of new technologies, green hydrogen is just one. How can we build trust across the financial components of that project or those ideas? There's also trust with insurers. There's trust up supply chains. Given the scale of infrastructure we're talking about here, supply chains have got to mobilise even before the projects appear. So how do you actually build that level of trust so that you can actually enable the net zero infrastructure needed? At the very core of this, though, is this idea of trust with communities. Not just First Nations communities, all of the communities that will be impacted by infrastructure development. And if you think about this, we're talking about 30 years of pretty significant infrastructure. Are communities going to accept that? So, there's definitely this level of trust that needs to be built there.
Yeah, and what I think I'm hearing you say, Paul, is it's trust across the entire supply chain with all parties.
Yeah.
Building trust across all of that. Great. Catherine, throwing to you now. What's your reaction to this and what's your experience being from WA where we've seen some industries grow very, very quickly? I'm really interested in your perspective.
Yeah, thanks for that, Sarah. And I think just building on what Paul had said, it's really around having some consistency, isn't it? Rather than just having headlines and talking the talk, it's actually walking the talk across the whole value chain that you're talking about. So I'm based in Western Australia. We've seen a few industries develop there. We had the iron ore industry that was developed, we had LNG industry, and I also had the privilege of being in Queensland where they had the coal seam gas to LNG industry that was developed. And I guess what I saw there was actually we need to move beyond a transactional mindset. It's one thing to engage with stakeholders with a tick and flick approach. Here, could you please sign this, and then I'll go on and move on and do my project. I think there needs to be a deeper engagement and constructive engagement so that there's more inclusion in it, and more around benefit sharing. And what really resonates for me is having that alignment of purpose, understanding actually that we have a common purpose around getting to net zero to decarbonise. Now let's actually have a grown-up conversation about how we're going to make it happen with mutual respect. I think that the other piece that I'd say, coming from Western Australia and from the gas industry, there is consultation fatigue. A lot of stakeholders have engaged, and I see a smile in the audience, they're engaged with governments, with think tanks, with all sorts of projects. They're just tired and there's so much swirl that there's no clarity about what it is that's trying to be developed. And it comes back to that consistency piece,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah, and certainty too, I think. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, thanks for that, Catherine. I'm staying with you, just an extension to that question. What are some of the risks you're seeing? We're talking about new technologies, as Paul indicated. We're talking about the emergence of new industries. What are some of the risks that you are seeing associated with that?
Okay, so I'll give you the big meta risk, and then I'll give you a couple of examples just to kind of build it out. And I think the big risk is a loss of momentum due to this disjointed approach that we're taking. We have many headlines, but how many real projects do we have going forward? If we can't actually deliver on our promises, it's actually going to lose trust. And this comes at a time where we're having, cost of living issues, we have heightened political issues, tensions. To get to the scale of what we need to do over the next 3 decades needs a consistent, deliberate approach. So I think that's the big risk for me, that we actually just lose our way or get distracted by something. More specifically, what sort of risks are we seeing? And this is based on the net zero work. It's really around 4 elements. And it's money, it's projects, it's people, and it's permitting. So if I take that in order, we need significant capital being deployed to be able to support the risks and build the pipeline of projects coming through. And in the case of green steel, it will take us engaging with our trading partners to make sure that we know what they want. Do we really know that the product that we're going to provide in our new U-Butte systems is what their furnaces can actually process? We need to have that engagement, and bearing in mind that their industrial complex is going to be affected by us changing what we're doing. If we're changing, you know, the fact that we're producing a beneficiated product rather than ore and energy, that's going to require change there. We need, next one on my list was around projects. Get that pipeline of projects. Where are they going to be? How are they going to be built out? Do we have supply chains? Is the concrete batching plants that we need going to be available where we need it? I talked about people. I think skills and workforce, it's very important to get the skills and labour there. Again, remote communities is going to require a whole lot of social infrastructure, which you can probably speak to. And the last one is permitting. So what we've seen in Australia is actually the permit timeframes have extended to years now, and that's actually getting in the way of actually being able to progress at the scale and speed that we need to get to net zero.
Really interested in that one, Catherine, because certainly that's the experience in Tasmania, is those very lengthy approval timeframes. Where does the role of community and trust come into that permitting? Because in my mind they're linked. I'd be interested if you've got a perspective on that, or Paul.
I'll just jump in. I think there's some experiences in Australia where large economic change has actually driven some very poor outcomes for communities involved. I'm aware of, particularly around the LNG projects in Queensland, the rents in communities suddenly tripled. Health systems were stretched. That sort of community infrastructure and community services that communities rely on very heavily was really stretched, and there were some very poor outcomes as a result. Now, if you look at the sort of infrastructure we're talking about here, those big renewable energy hubs, out in fairly isolated locations, there are small dependent communities in those areas, and if all of a sudden you bring in 1,000 workers, there's that whole fly in, fly out issue. It's a very, very sensitive thing, and I think we can learn some big lessons from those big economic infrastructure plays that we've had over the last 20, 30 years.
And can I just jump on that now that I've had a chance to collect my thoughts? I think there is perhaps a bit of a expectation that dealing with communities is going to be linear. We have engineering, project plans, and we have great milestones, but actually dealing with communities and people is not linear. It actually takes time, it takes effort, it takes conversations to really embed it. So I think that's probably an issue to be kept in the back of the mind.
Yeah, I agree. And I think also the point, Catherine, around you talked about fatigue. None of these projects are happening in isolation. So if you think about even a single hydrogen project, what's required, there's wind farms, there's pipelines, there's ports, there's water, there's electricity. The fact that you actually start to get an accumulation of project elements that need to be considered and it viewed through the community lens. So at the moment, I think we're trying to build trust on a single project, and what we perhaps need to be doing is looking at it from the individual or from the community and seeing the multitude of kind of impacts that's having, and how do we actually best start to communicate some of these challenges. Excellent. Switching pace a little bit back to you, Paul. You did some work at Princeton University. Do you agree with some of the risks that Catherine was highlighting? And how do you think that might apply across the renewable sector in Australia?
Yeah, well, everyone loves the renewable energy project, right?
Especially in my backyard, Paul.
I grew up in Newcastle in the Hunter Valley, and right now there's a big push for offshore wind in that area, and there are all sorts of reasons for that. And there's a big groundswell of action against that. And that's actually surprised me as a Novocastrian. Even though I'm based in London at the moment, I'm watching it with a lot of interest. Any project developer has to be aware that they cannot guarantee having community support.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. In fact, I think we should start from the place that we need to, from a foundation of zero, to build, from which to build support, rather than assume we're going to accept it. Agree.
One of the privileges we have working with Princeton is you get access to some pretty good minds. There's a guy called Rob Sokolow in Princeton, and he framed it very well. He said, we don't necessarily have social license to act against climate change. And it's a very interesting thing to dwell on. You might think we do, but in fact, when it comes down to the hard infrastructure required to deal with it, we don't. And it's not just the wind farms, it's also the enabling infrastructure. I know there's a lot of problems in areas where trying to develop hydrogen, so putting pipelines through, putting transmission grids, so that's an issue in Australia already. There's some of the big renewable infrastructure hubs, getting that transmission system through. Now, curiously, one of the things that we think is evident is that you have to personalise the climate story. So there's a developer I'm aware of in the US, and they've said when you go to a community, say it's a solar or wind farm, and you make an argument around the environmental benefits from that, it just doesn't work. They're just not interested. But what they are interested, if you say, okay, you may not be able to fish like you have before because climate's going to impact your fishing grounds, it completely changes the narrative. So this idea of personalising to direct impacts on communities at a very personal level is important.
Excellent.
Can I just jump on that as well? The mention of transmission lines is a fairly heated topic in Australia. I'm not sure if you know, but there's the transmission lines, there are some links being put in to be able to support the net zero transition, but actually local communities don't want them, and there's a real push to have underground, the transmission lines put underground. Now, Powerlink, which is a Queensland provider, and Curtin University did an interesting study where they actually engaged with the communities and from a systems approach and a social contract approach to lay out why the costs and implications of having above ground versus below ground transmission lines. And the community actually understood that actually technically and from a cost perspective, undergrounding transmission lines in remote areas doesn't make a lot of sense, and that money can be better deployed for other reasons. So it's a much more collaborative and respectful engagement to say, well, actually, as a rule of thumb, we don't need to have all of our transmission lines undergrounded. Let's make an informed decision about where it should be, in sensitive areas where it impacts on community, but actually it's not the first thing that we need to think about. So I'd really commend you sort of having a look into that from a social perspective.
So Sarah, I'm going to jump in here and ask you a question. So you and GHD have some really good experience working with communities faced with infrastructure developments in Australia. So I'm curious about, what have you seen on the ground that's been done badly in the past and that we need to learn from? And do you think that trust deficit exists as a result?
Oh, absolutely. There's no doubt about it. And I think, we've got, in some ways, ourselves to blame from our behaviours of the past following us into the future. And particularly with new industries, I think we've got an opportunity to try and rewrite how we might work with communities in the future, because it's got to move beyond an adversarial relationship towards one, if we're going to get to net zero, towards one that actually builds mutual benefit. But I think in terms of some of your questions around deficit of trust, absolutely, and I think maybe picking up on your point, Catherine, one of the things that we see, we did some work in the hydrogen industry on how communities feel about this new industry and what do they know, and other than having a complete lack of sort of detailed understanding of hydrogen, what the opportunity, what it means, why, how, all of that, the number one reason that was cited around sort of area of concern or something that led to some anxiety was a real benefit scepticism. So developers, governments, people had promised in the past to actually deliver things, and then, this is going to mean 10,000 jobs for your region, this is going to mean, so much investment, or here's the economic number in the billions that is going to be beneficial to your community. And then communities have actually not seen that followed through and not experienced perhaps the benefits that they were promised. So I think that whole scepticism around, well, I don't trust you, is actually really critical, because we've got an opportunity now to build the honesty, the reality and the honesty in what's actually going to be delivered on ground to communities. And I think we must. So that benefit scepticism one is there. And I think there's also a lack of authentic engagement. I think quite often in infrastructure, large-scale infrastructure development, I might just ask down the back if you could be a little bit quiet, please. It's next door, great. I think we've actually, we haven't we haven't really had authentic conversations. We've come with a really fixed position around, I have project X and it's going to go here, and then we've tried to make it fit, rather than coming with we've got this concept of this idea and working collaboratively to actually get that through and supportive with the community. So how do we start from a place of, we not necessarily need to be less fixed in our starting conversation with communities, and be open to sort of suggestions and ideas that come through from them.
So I want you to give me a specific example
Of where it's done and
of where we've done something badly.
I would say probably a high point is perhaps when a project was announced on Facebook that meant that 70 people were going to have their properties acquired, and their landscape changed quite significantly, and they heard about it via the media on Facebook. And I think that's not how you start a project, from a position of respect, of a position of authentic engagement, and a position of open to building trust and rapport with the community. So that's not, unfortunately, not uncommon.
So once you lose that trust, just to pursue that a second,
Yeah.
once you lose that trust, is it hard to get it back?
Absolutely, yeah. And because whatever you come in with, I'm not coming with open ears to hear you. I'm coming with somewhat reluctantly, because my experience of you or of the project is in fact one that hasn't done the right thing, hasn't acted with integrity, hasn't acted with honesty.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about what we've done wrong, and we now want to move towards what we can do right. So what can we do differently? So I want the panel, there's only three of us, to look ahead to the future and think about what can we do differently now. And I want us to focus on how do we build that trust, and in fact, how do we maintain that trust? What actions can we take? What new approaches might there be? And to frame this again, we need to build a lot of infrastructure to meet net zero. And that's to provide climate impacts for everyone, climate impact resolution for everyone, and that means a new level of social contract and the issue of trust to help make that happen. So back to you, Sarah.
Yep.
So building on from what you've just said, how, in your view, can we build the type of trust needed to see very significant infrastructure deployed in Australia, impacting many communities? And do you have any examples where this has worked?
I might start with what I think is a really positive example, and perhaps starts to frame some of the conversation moving forward. So there's an Aboriginal corporation up in the Pilbara, which is a very resource-rich area of Australia, and they have now an energy corporation associated with them, and together with a very experienced developer, they are now building a wind and solar farm and transmission line to help to decarbonise Rio Tinto's operation. So this is about a co-design. It's not a developer saying there's land here, it's got good resources, and I'm going to come here and do it. It's an Aboriginal corporation saying, we think there's some possibility here. Who can we work with? Who can we partner with? Who might have the experience to actually guide us through as a new organisation and build our internal capacity and build our capability to actually then look at a project that is a win for the developer, it's a win for the Aboriginal corporation, and it's a win for Rio Tinto in a decarbonised power. So how can we look at these solutions as a starting point from a, how might we, as opposed to here's a project and this is what it's going to look like. So I think sometimes we go far too far down the sort of development pathway before we have those conversations to build engagement and build community.
Can I just jump in?
Yeah, jump in.
Can I just jump in actually, because I realise that we talk about trust, and it just occurred to me that maybe trust comes in at different levels. And are we talking about trust at a company level, at a personal level? Can you maybe unpick that for me in the sorts of things that you've seen, Sarah?
Yeah, I think I'd say at all levels, but fundamentally, and Paul, your example's lovely. Fundamentally, we're human beings, and we like to know that we're going to be okay and looked after. So, appealing to the fishing story, appealing to the individual, and building trust at an individual level. If I've built a relationship and trust with you, Catherine, and then our organisations might need to go together, as individuals we are more able to broker and speak for the organisation, speak for the qualities, speak for the values where there's that alignment and that kind of potential to link together. So I think, that sort of an analogy about being zippered, I think we need trust in governments, we need trust in industry, we need trust in academia, and I think, that at its heart, it comes down to building that relationship and rapport at an individual level that then allows us to build that at a broader level. Because if you don't have trust in the individual, I don't know how you're going to then build trust in the organisation. It's a more difficult task to perhaps build trust in the organisation.
What's really unfortunate is we're missing our First Nations representative, because we're about to ask him the question, and it's maybe something we can see whether we can have a shot at answering it, which is that First Nations people are stewards and custodians of country, and connection is ongoing and enduring. How do governments and industries create opportunities to build deeper collaboration, consensus and new ways of working together? So what actions could we take now to build those enduring relationships with First Nations people that are going to be needed?
Yeah, I'm happy to sort of...
have a shot.
Have a shot. And my first question would be ask, don't assume. So, what are the things that we shouldn't come in with a set of, our personal assumptions or our country's assumptions around how things work, but ask the question around how they might work. Where is the opportunity? And if we start from a place of actually being open and trying to find commonality, even when there's differences, and even when perhaps we don't align ideologically, and we don't align maybe politically, where is that common ground and where can we start from a place that allows us to explore it? And I think the other thing for me is that radical listening. We are very good at talking and putting our position forward. What I think we need to get better at is actually being open to hearing alternative perspectives. I think, we sometimes we confuse this the urgency of the task in front of us and the complexity of the task in front of us. We forget to be human. So how can we actually listen to then seek to understand, to seek to find common ground and seek to find understanding? So that would probably be my sort of two takes: is A, ask, and B, listen.
One of the points we were going to make with Rowan was this incredible knowledge that First Nations people have of country. And it's really just a point to be made. Maybe someone will have an opinion, but how can we better recognise that knowledge and actually use that knowledge? Many years ago, I was actually the project manager on a wind farm project right down in the south of Western Australia. And we did the usual botanical surveys that are required, but we also did an ethno-botanical survey. And that was an incredible experience, including First Nations elders in that part of the world. And what was incredible is literally we were walking along and one of the Aboriginal people said, "Oh, there's a nama hole there, so make sure your road doesn't come through here." I didn't even know what a nama hole was. And it was actually a hole in the rock where they used to find water, and it still had a rock on top of it, which had probably been there for thousands of years. And just that incredible depth of experience, and including some of the flora that they said, look, it'll come up after a fire. You might not see it for 50 years. So is there any comment on the use of that Indigenous knowledge of country? Do we think that's important to build trust?
Yeah, I think and the other thing I'd add to that, Paul, is there's some organisations are using Indigenous co-design, so that process whereby the coming together of knowledge from all different perspectives to actually start to shape some of these infrastructure projects into the future is I think very valuable, where there's that dual learning and dual experience. But actually, if we're wanting, if 42%, 45% of the projects we might need for Net Zero Australia are in fact on country, then we'd be stupid not to take advantage of some of the learnings and knowledge that exists in those areas in whatever way is meaningful to those communities. But maybe, Catherine, there's something else from your perspective?
Yeah, no, I agree. It really comes down to that listening piece. And the little anecdote that I'll tell actually is a colleague of mine was involved in dealing with the local Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders people up north. And the usual approach from a company is you kind of roll in with your cars and you've got a deadline and you have slide decks and you talk very, animatedly at them and talk loudly and you talk to them more. This guy tried a different approach, and he just pulled up in his Land Cruiser on the side of the road just out of town, set up a little campfire, put the billy on, and he just waited. And the local elders came to visit him to say, what are you doing here? And actually what he did was he was inviting the conversation rather than telling them the conversation. So.
Right, we've got more time up our sleeve than we thought. I'm curious. I don't know who can hear us out there, It's certainly very hard. You can up the back, that's good. I'm curious, does anyone have an opinion on this issue of deficit of trust? Does anyone have something to say? Put your hand up. We've got a roving mic up the back there.
Hi everyone, I'm Kylie Johnson. I have a long and rich history in this space, but I, at the moment, have got a Churchill Fellowship looking at net zero emission heavy vehicles and trucking, of all things, because I look like a trucker. And I have found that the trust thing is really important, that truckies are businessmen and women. They know how to run a business, and they feel that things are being inflicted on them.
Imposed, yeah.
But it's going to happen. And in the same way that these things happened, smartphones, technology, digital, it's all happening. So the trust element is very important, and what I think is fascinating is watching corporate worlds take this mantle and run with it. So I guess my point is there's no point inflicting this on people. You've got to bring them with you, and I'm wondering how you do that from the ground up.
Yeah, I think that's one of the. Thank you very much. And I think one of probably the first points I'd make is I actually think we've got a lack of understanding and a lack of education just around the enormity of the task, around the complexity of all the pieces that need to fit together. We take the trucking industry. What's required within the trucking industry to actually decarbonise? There's lots of wind farm. There's decisions around whether you're going electric, whether you're going alternative or low carbon fuels or hydrogen. What does that mean? How do we actually make it work? How do we ensure that we get a single system for charging or for refuelling? So even that one sort of very small issue, we actually haven't solved collectively that message of shared understanding. So how does government, does industry, do communities work together to build that message around what it is, what it's going to take, and what the requirement, and the fact that we need to get very unpolitical about the fact there will be changes and impacts in this. And at the moment, I think, unfortunately, this global issue of decarbonisation and reaching net zero has become highly politicised, and we somehow need to decouple them in order to get that consistent. Communities need trust built on consistency, built on information that is valid and reliable, and we don't even necessarily have that platform just yet.
I really like your point actually about the people at the ground level and the fact that actually things happen around them. I think one of the steps that we do need is to be able to articulate the scale of the challenge and how it'll impact everyone, which is where Net Zero Australia was trying to come to say, actually, yes, we get to net zero, but rather than just having it as some ethereal concept, this is what it looks like in time and in space, so that you can start to work around it and go, okay, it's not a question of not doing it in my backyard, do it over there. It's actually how do we all work together with that aligned purpose of decarbonising.
Actually, there's another dimension to trust that came to mind when you're talking about trucking, and that is trust that the fuel's going to be there. And that was always an issue with electric vehicles. I think that's slowly being overcome. But again, another dimension of trust. Anyone else have an opinion? Up front here.
No, I'm not Australian. I'm from Japan. Okay. But of course, I think you know that there are many Japanese companies who really try to invest a huge amount of money for so-called development of renewable energy to really achieve a green so-called hydrogen, that kind of thing. But recently I heard that one Japanese company is involved in a project which would hurt the right of indigenous people, but probably they do not know, because indigenous people issues are not at all common in our society. We have only one, but it's not a big issue. So when you talk about trust and you talk about finance, but it's not only within the Australia, but you also, in a sense, persuade foreign capitals who are not who are not familiar with the issue. So how do you overcome that kind of, expanding the trust network beyond Australia? Otherwise, we do not want to introduce the so-called green hydrogen, which really, against indigenous people right, indigenous people community life, but we do not have any kind of measures in a sense, because it's really indirect thing. So I really like to know how we can really keep that kind of the good network of trust with other foreign national companies? How do you think of it?
It's a good question. And in fact, we're going to be doing some work on that for our next From Ambition to Reality paper next year. So we don't have all the answers to that, but you're absolutely hit on a key issue. Trust between corporations, commercial entities, and typically that involves, legal counsel at 20 paces. What we'll be looking for over the next 12 months are examples where trust is actually an element of commercial contracts and what that actually looks like. And certainly for green steel, getting back to our original point, there's going to have to be trust with our trading partners. This is one reason why LNG has been such a success in Australia, because there's been that trust in supply, right? Because countries like Japan are dependent on that energy. And it's no different in decarbonisation. Are there any other comments? Otherwise, despite the noise, despite one of our panellists not turning up, we've persevered. Are there any other comments? Otherwise, I'm going to turn to Sarah to wrap up. Sarah.
Wow, thank you very much. So some interesting sort of concepts coming through today. We've heard about the fact the energy transition, the pathway to green iron, the build out of infrastructure is not happening in a vacuum. It's happening amongst a whole range of other changes, a whole range of other global and local perspectives. We've heard about the need for trust in our supply chain, the fact that trust needs to be built around multiple levels of organisations, but essentially starts with an individual and individual relationships. We've heard about the fact we need to be more human and enter into sort of engagement and communication and understanding to actually bring the community on board with what's actually happening, or bring the community to a point where they can have an active conversation and an active understanding. We've also heard about the comment around we actually need to be involved with rather than imposed on the energy transition, that there's a role for everyone, whether it be individuals in communities, organisations, governments, trading partners, actually to have a voice and a say in this, rather than just be told this is your lot. And all of this obviously happening at a rapid and unpredictable change. We've heard that some of our models for how we regulate, how we invest and how we permit projects is actually not serving our purpose well, and will need to be changed into the future. Perhaps I might hold it there, and Catherine, ask you as a closing comment. Oh, sorry, I didn't do that very well. As a closing comment around, if you had to leave the audience with that one thing, that one action, that one word, what might it be?
I think the word that I would leave with is energised. There's a great opportunity here. We can see the scale of the challenge, but actually it's on all of us to get after it. So yeah, energised.
Yep. What about you, Paul?
And you're going to ask me the same question?
Yeah.
Look, the energy transition is essential. We have to deal with this problem. And if we just think about the green steel concept, there is an enormous opportunity for Australia here. We have all the elements to make that succeed, but it's not going to happen by default. It actually requires a concerted effort for that to happen. So let me turn the question around to you, Sarah. What's your one word?
Mine's hope. So I'm hopeful. I think there is, and particularly if I look at green steel and the processing, the opportunity in Australia, I think there's actually, we might have been founded on the sheep's back, but maybe there's an opportunity for our next, Australia 2.0 to be actually based on this energy transformation, energy revolution. So I'm really hopeful. I'm hopeful that we actually start to see the importance of people and communities in the energy transition as a lens from which to move forward. So is that energised, essentially energised and hopeful? I think we are as a panel. Before I thank both of our panellists, I think, hey, that's the four of us, including our friend Rowan, who couldn't be here. And we've all been involved in some interesting and diverse projects and opportunities when it comes to the energy transition, when it comes to green steel, and when it comes to communities. So we will hang around, I think, for the next half an hour or so. If there are any questions, we'd love to meet you, hear from you, and thank you all for being here. Thank you, Paul.